Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Now, our super local look at what's going on in the Maryland General Assembly and the Arundel County Council. I'm Dave Abrams. In this episode, we will take a look at the county budget, which was recently approved by the County Council. Our guests today are Chief Administrative Officer John Hammond and Education Director Amalie Brandenburg to fill us in on all the highlights. Thank you both for joining us today.
It's our pleasure to be here, Dave.
Thank you for having us.
Well, let's start with you, Mr. Hammond, and talk about what was probably the issue that most people were following or trying to understand the most is taxes. County Executive Shue proposed a 3-cent property tax reduction. There was then a compromise with 3 members of the council to reduce the income tax. Walk us through what the end result was and what this means to taxpayers in terms of savings.
Okay, well, on the property tax, the county executive actually proposed a 3% reduction in the property tax rate below the rate reduction that would have to be implemented as a consequence of the county's property tax revenue cap. The county's property tax revenue cap limits the amount of property tax revenue the county can take in year to year to the increase in the rate of inflation, with an exception for new construction is not included in that calculation. This year, the rate of inflation for tax cap purposes was actually 0%. The consumer price index for over the last 12 months, January to January, was flat. There was no increase. So because assessments had increased somewhat, that meant that under the property tax revenue cap, the rate actually had to be reduced a little bit. On top of that, the county executive, trying to live up to one of his campaign promises, wanted to reduce the tax rate 3% below that, and actually would have taken that rate below 90 cents, so actually to 89.5 cents. But during the budget process, because of the give and take of the process with the county council, a compromise was reached to, instead of having a reduction in the property tax, switch to having a reduction in the income tax. So the actual reduction in the income tax that was finally arrived at through the budget process, the ultimate compromise was that the county's income tax rate will fall from 2.56% to 2.5%. And that decrease in the income tax rate will take effect on January 1. The income tax is based on the tax year, which follows the calendar year. So even though the county's fiscal year begins on July 1, the reduction in the income tax administered by the state will actually take effect on January 1.
So how will people see that take effect, number one? And number two, I think you've done some analysis. How does this tax reduction overall fit in historically in Arundel County?
Yeah, the reduction is in the neighborhood of $11 million. It's probably, since we've had the tax cap, the largest reduction in taxes that we've seen in the 22 years since the tax cap has come into play. It will manifest itself for most folks in their weekly or biweekly paycheck, where they'll see a slight reduction in the amount of income tax withheld from their paychecks.
Ms. Brandenburg, you oversee issues related to education, including libraries, the community college, and the public school system. Give us a sort of an overview of how the budget played out in terms of education for public schools.
Certainly. Our pre-K through 12 system saw $621 million historic funding from the county and $17 million over what they received last year. Included in that $17 million will be a pay package for our teachers and other school system employees. The contract school expansion, Monarch Global up in Laurel, and it also included funding for Dr. Arlotta's Triple E program, Triple E initiative.
And so teachers will get raises under this budget. And could you tell us a little bit about what the Triple E program is?
Certainly. It's enhancing early childhood education. And essentially what it does is it provides one more period or one more slot in the scheduling for elementary school teachers, for elementary school children to experience another special like art or music or PE. They do different programs like STEM or World Classical Language or whatever else is appropriate for your school environment. But in doing so, when they schedule, they also make sure that all the other team members if let's say it's a third grade team, all of the third grade classes, one will be at PE, one will be at music, one will be in the Triple E program, and the teachers will have an opportunity to sit down and collaboratively plan together.
I see. Tell us a little bit about the capital side of the ledger. You have operating, which pays for salaries and programs, and then you have capital that pays construction money for new schools and bridges, roads, things like that. What's in the capital budget for schools?
We had a well-constructed capital budget this year. It includes funding for continued construction for Severna Park High School, for Benfield Elementary in Severna Park, also for Rolling Knolls Elementary, as well as several other elementary schools for planning and feasibility dollars.
And I believe the two schools you mentioned, elementary schools, are $15 million apiece, roughly.
Yep.
And is Severna Park High School almost finished? Is it going to be finished in this capital budget, or is it next year?
No, Severna Park High School has a couple more years left. It has to finish construction of the building itself and then the fields afterwards, the athletic stadium, athletic fields.
Mr. Hammond, let's come back to you for a second. One of, I think, the least understood aspects of the budget this year was what we call Jumpstart Arundel, which is Jumpstart and Arundel, which is to extend the period of time for purchasing bonds that we use to finance construction projects. I believe it was from 25 to 30 years. This was a proposal by the county executive that was adopted by the council. Could you explain sort of how that works?
Sure. Actually, what was involved is historically the county has used 20-year bonds to fund its capital program on the general county side. On the utility side, water and sewer, we typically do sell 30-year bonds. What the county executive proposed in this year's budget was to use 30-year bonds for the general county projects, the schools, the firehouses, police stations, roads, bridges, whatever. Rather than sell 20-year bonds for those long-term assets, the county executive proposed budget called for using 30-year bonds. And the advantage of using 30-year bonds is that with the same annual debt service, you can do a lot more projects. It's very similar to the situation that folks find when they buy their home, that you can get a 20-year mortgage on your home or a 30-year mortgage on your home. With a 20-year mortgage, your monthly payment is at a higher level than with a 30-year mortgage. So by having a 30-year mortgage, you're able to get more house for the same payment, the same monthly payment. The price of that is obviously you're making those payments over 30 years rather than 20 years. But in the situation that the county finds itself with a tremendous backlog in capital projects, schools, fire stations, just maintaining county buildings, building libraries, we can use that extended time period, that level debt service between 30 and 20 years, to build more assets. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to catch up on the backlog of capital projects, and that's the concept of jump-starting Anne Arundel, to try to get more capital projects underway while keeping our annual debt service at the same level.
And basically this means that each year in the capital budget there will be about $25 million additional available at each given year.
Yes, that's correct. Typically with our 20-year bond program, we've been able to support $120 million in borrowing each year. Going to 30-year bonds will allow us to borrow an additional $25 million up to $145 million a year and still maintain the same level of debt service each year. Now again, obviously there is the cost of interest over that extended period of time, but again, given the tremendous backlog and the need to build some of these projects sooner rather than later, and taking advantage of the historically low interest rates that exist today, particularly at the long end of the yield curve. 30-year rates are not much higher than 20-year rates. So we've got a very advantageous market situation to build this bond program on by extending the maturity from 20 to 30 years.
And also we mentioned that we have two elementary schools that are about $15 million apiece, just to give people a reference point. For $25 million more per year, that's probably going to get broken up into small increments, but it helps facilitate some of these larger projects.
I think you ought to look in the context that we fund these elementary schools over generally 2 years. So a typical elementary school these days ends up costing us around $30 million. And another interesting fact of this 20-year versus 30 years is, if we go back and look, how much did it cost to build an elementary school 20 years ago? About $11 million. Today, 20 years later, that cost is $30 million. So the cost of construction, the cost of regulations have gone up over 20 years, so that it's much more advantageous to build those projects today and avoid the increasing costs of construction and regulation, which are substantially higher growth than the interest rate that you're paying on those projects.
That's a good point. It's kind of hard to get around, but I think you explained it very well. And the other thing is that just like your mortgage, you can pay it off faster if you choose to. And I believe there have been examples in the past where the county has, is it called calling the bonds?
Well, what we do is we always are paying attention on a monthly basis to the cost of interest, and just like anybody with their home again, when interest rates fall, folks refinance their mortgage, and we do the same thing with our bonds. When interest rates fall, we will refinance our bonds and take advantage of the lower interest rates. But as I said earlier, we're seeing rates now at historically low levels, and we have been aggressively refunding our bonds the last 10 years to take advantage of these lower interest rates. Everybody's predicting interest rates now will be going up. We'll see. I don't have a great crystal ball. I try to stay away from forecasting rates, but the expectation is that the Federal Reserve in the short term will be raising rates, but they'll not do it in such a fashion that things will get out of control. And I think the prudent thing to do is, and we will continue to do, is obviously monitor the financial markets. But again, given where we are in the market, 30-year bonds are a real plus right now.
Well, I think you have a pretty good track record of budgeting conservatively, so I think we can feel safe in your hands and from that.
Well, thanks. We try to be conservative because we're dealing with the taxpayers' money.
And Ms. Brandenburg, let's talk about the capital budget again. Two of the more controversial projects fell in your area of expertise. One of those is Crofton High School, which was obviously a very big priority for the county executive. He included money in the 5-year, 6-year capital plan to start building that school, which depends on a lot of factors going forward. But walk us through where we are with Crofton High School now that the budget is complete.
Certainly. The county executive had put $77.5 million in. This year he had put $500,000 in for viability study, and then in out years for construction dollars he'd put another $77 million in. As it stands now, we have $350,000 to do a viability study, which is the important first steps. We'll do soil sampling, we'll do specimen sampling. Like Mr. Hammond had alluded to before, so much has changed in the last 20 years. The site that we've selected potentially is where Crofton Middle School is located, and we want to make sure that in fact a high school is appropriate to fit on that site, and that's what we'll use those dollars for. Unfortunately, the council cut all the out year dollars. The county executive is certainly committed to this project, and when we redo the budget again.
And that capacity remains out there, and that's one of the benefits, again, of the 30-year bond program that will allow us to construct the Crofton High School should the feasibility reports come out as we anticipate them. And in concert with the state's interagency school construction program, we have the capacity to build the Crofton High School, again, because we have stepped out and used 30-year bonds.
So there's a lot going on with Crofton. Although it would have been nice to have the placeholder money in there, as you said, the important thing right now, the priority is to have the money to study it and come back next year with that money again for construction. Tell us a little bit about what's called the MGT study. What is that, and what's the scope of it and the timeline, basically?
Certainly. 10 years ago, Anne Arundel County Public Schools, in concert with the Board of Education and with the county executive and the county council, did their 10-year facility master plan. It was only the shelf life of it was 10 years. It was 2005, and so we're revisiting that project again. And they've contracted with a company called MGT America. And again, the scope was developed by the Board of Education and Arundel County Public Schools Administration, the county executive, and the county council. And what it will do is it will look at the existing fleet of schools that we have, and it will sort of take out some of the political nature of it, and it goes through a very systematic, very data-driven process to determine in what order the schools need to be constructed. At the same time, they're going to look at our existing fleet. Does it meet the needs of our enrollment and our projected enrollment? So do we need to add additional schools to the 121 that we have now? Also part of the scope of work is they're looking at school size, and particularly high school size, and what it would cost to have the county look at a smaller high school size and how that looks in each feeder system. For example, Old Mill is, in theory, the next school to be renovated. And does that school system work best with 2 smaller high schools, 3 smaller high schools, 1 large high school, and they'll cost it out, and they'll do that for each feeder system moving forward.
And Old Mill is one of our largest, if not our largest high school. Is South River the largest, or is it Old Mill?
Meade High School, I believe, is the largest.
Meade, okay. But Old Mill has roughly, what is it, 20?
It's well over 2,000 students.
Right, right. And this is, you know, we try not to throw too many numbers out there, but the county executive is interested in the idea of smaller schools that once you get over 2,000, you're really losing the economy of scale that if you're trying to operate efficiently, you're kind of losing that once you go over a certain level. And so he wants to move to a system where we build smaller schools that are more student focused and also economically viable.
It's very interesting. We have 12 comprehensive high schools here in the county, and we have the largest average size high school in the entire state of Maryland. 6 of our 12 high schools are over 2,000. But to put it in perspective, Howard County has about 50,000 students, and they also have 12 comprehensive high schools. We've not built a new high school here since 1982, and we go back to what we were speaking about before, Crofton High School. It's time.
And obviously for decades now, students in the Crofton area they get to middle school and then they get split up into Arundel and South River, and this is very important for that community. So hopefully we'll get good news from the study, and the council will support this project going forward, and we'll be able to, you know, answer the call out in West County. Let's move to Annapolis for a second, because the other big controversial capital project was the Annapolis Library, which needs to be renovated, and now it's going to be replaced. And tell us about sort of where we were at the beginning of the budget and where we are now with that project.
Annapolis Library is one of the most pressing projects for the library system. The building is undersized and it's antiquated, and it was built, I believe, in 1965, maybe 1967. It's time to be replaced. The original proposal was to build a 48,000 square foot library, which financially is just not feasible when you look at the cost of about $815, maybe $820 a square foot. And much like Mr. Hammond was saying, what is our total PAYGO, our total general obligation?
Well, we have, with a 30-year program, we have $145 million of bond capacity each year. And obviously the school system consumes a great deal of that, and that's a very necessary part of the capital budget. But we obviously have responsibilities when it comes to the library and to the community college too. And we haven't done a library in 10 years. I think the last library we did was the West County Library over in Odenton. And as Amalie pointed out, the Annapolis Library I used when I was a high school student on West Street.
They had books?
They had books back then, Dave. Yes,
Wow.
they did.
Yes.
They were stone tablets, but they still had
Really
them on the
heavy.
shelves.
Really heavy books.
So, yes, but understanding our capital program and understanding our borrowing capacity, and knowing that the library system, 7 of the 15 libraries were built all around the same time, they've all come up for replacement at this time. So the county executive has put 2 in its capital budget program, both Annapolis and Rivera Beach. But in order to balance the needs of the entire county, including the libraries, the community college, roads, infrastructure, et cetera, we were unfortunately not financially able to build a 48,000 square foot library. And so after much discussion with key stakeholders, with community leaders, with the library board, with the library CEO, with members of the county council, we were able to arrive at a compromise which fits financially within our budget at 32,500 square feet.
And do we know when this project breaks ground?
The project probably will break ground sometime in fiscal year 17. There's a property acquisition. And,
Which is next year.
Right, the following year. There's engineering work that needs to be done and property acquisition work to be done. And the other area of responsibility that Amalie has is the community college, and the good news on the capital budget there was, again, partially responsible because of the 30-year bonds, was the ability to move up the health professions building, a much needed project at the community college, up a year in the capital budget, and get that one moving starting in fiscal year 17. So I think the community college is very happy
And that's
with
that's an $80 million project.
Yeah, that's
It will
another
make a
very
big
expensive
difference.
project. Yeah, I mean, that's an $80 million project. And just going back to what I was talking about earlier, you know, we think in terms of elementary schools costing $30 million nowadays. A middle school is in the $60 to $65 million range. And Severna Park High School, which is underway now, is $135 million. And as Amalie also mentioned, the next up is Old Mill and Crofton, and those costs don't stop going up. And again, that's why jump-starting makes sense to get those projects underway sooner rather than later, because the costs of construction are ever increasing.
Well, we made light of your age, but how long have you been working with the county now?
This is my 22nd budget that's just completed, and every year is a different experience.
Absolutely. Tell us, before we go, tell us a little bit about some things that stood out to you that were unique or different about this budget than the ones in the past.
Well, I think we had a number of new policy issues to deal with, and that consumed a great deal of the budget process. The emphasis that the county executive was putting on tax reduction consumed a lot of the discussion of how the budget should be formulated, and an integral part of that, again, was the going to 30-year bonds from 20-year bonds. I mean, those two issues were major changes in the way the county does business, but I think we're focused on the long-term goals that the county executive has set when he chose to run for county executive.
Was it a little better to be dealing with this budget than the recession budgets that you've done for the last, what, 6 years?
My standard line is, it's from a budget standpoint, believe it or not, it's always easier to deal with less money rather than more money. So the recession, albeit challenging, everybody understood the situation, and the request for projects, the request for programs, weren't there. They understood the problem. Now that we're coming out of the recession, the good news is we are coming out of the recession. We can get back on track, and everybody wants something. And you know, I spend a lot of time saying no, and doesn't make me the most popular guy in town, but we have to live within our budget just as the taxpayers do.
So you're saying you don't necessarily say no less because we have more money? You still
No,
say
I'm very good at saying no all the time.
Okay, good. Well, thank you to both of you for taking the time to come on the show and explain the budget for the citizens who want to know more about it. And I'm sure you could both use a little break now after what, a good 3 months of intense budget action, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you to our guests, John Hammond and Amalie Brandenburg. You can find out more details about the budget at www.aacounty.org. The full approved budget will be posted online by the end of this month. We'll see you next time.